Hey guys, so this one's going to go a little bit more quickly for you, but as the war is starting to end up, what we're going to really see is how the major leaders, especially of the Allied powers, are really going to decide how to wrap up this war. So we do sign a treaty called the Treaty of San Francisco, but it's really going to be more important at a series of conferences, what is decided in these conferences before the war even ends, that's really going to determine what Europe is going to look like for the next for the rest of the 20th century, really. So we're going to be looking at that today, but we're going to start by looking at some of the key people who are involved. These are, again, the major Allied leaders. So I want to give you a little bit about who they are and kind of what they're looking to get out of these conferences. So the first is Joseph Stalin. So Joseph Stalin came to be the leader of the USSR in the 1930s, and he's kind of an unknown. The USSR is kind of an unknown. As a communist country, a lot of people are really iffy about it. We don't really like it. We don't really want to deal with it. And American leaders are kind of I don't really know what we don't like communism, and same in Britain. So Joseph Stalin, just a little bit about who he is. He is super paranoid. He probably had reason to be. He was pretty mean. He would, people would just disappear in Russia, and they would be wiped out of photographs and wiped out of existence, essentially. And of course he had a lot of enemies, but he was also really paranoid about those enemies. He kind of always was looking over his shoulder, making sure, are you following me? What's going on? Because of his paranoia, he's kind of afraid to travel outside of the Soviet Union. He really just is kind of feeling if I'm on my home front, at least I'm okay. If I'm outside, somebody might get me. So you'll notice a lot of these conferences take place in Soviet-controlled territory, and that's because Stalin doesn't really want to go anywhere because he's kind of afraid. He really wants to seem pretty tough, and he is. But at the same time, the Soviet Union is not super powerful. They are kind of suffering. They suffered a lot when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and so they're kind of suffering. And he wants to kind of make it seem like he's tougher than he actually is, but he's actually kind of a scared little boy. He's pretty defensive, right? He always what are you trying to say? What you looking at, right? Right? He relies a lot on spies, and he kind of has them incorporated all over the place, and he's just, not a super great guy. He is desperate for help on the European front. He's pretty much the only one fighting the Soviet Union front, and he really, really wants the other allies to, send him help. He's guys, you really need to, help us out. We are trying to defeat Hitler here. It'd be really cool if you could just, throw us a bone, because, it's pretty tough, right? He also wants to kind of keep a control over Eastern Europe after the war. He kind of feels like he has the right to them. A lot of them have been controlled by Russia in the past. So that's kind of what he's looking to get out of these conferences. So he wants help on the Eastern Front, and he wants people to kind of let him take over some of Eastern Europe. So next we got FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. So FDR and Winston Churchill are besties. They're oh my god, FDR, you're the coolest guy ever. No, Churchill, you are super, super cool. They actually wrote these letters back and forth to each other about how awesome it was to be their best friend. These guys had man crushes on each other, essentially, is what's going on here. FDR kind of looks at Stalin as you know what, I can handle him. He is not that big of a deal. I can deal with Stalin, right? He's just a bully, right? I can take care of Stalin. So he doesn't really see Stalin as a threat. Much like Stalin needs help on the Eastern Front, FDR is really looking for help on the Pacific Front. We have some help from the Australians, but it's Australia, let's face it, they're not giving us a whole lot of help. So we would really love the British Navy to send some of their boys over here to give us a hand on the Pacific Front. His real goal, he really wants to see all of Europe become very democratic, very capitalist. Not necessarily we're going to go up to Stalin and be you have to get rid of your communist empire, but we would really like to kind of set up Germany and a lot of these other countries that have been Axis powers that way. Next we have Winston Churchill. So Winston Churchill is the Prime Minister of Britain. He, like I said before, loves FDR. He thinks FDR is super, super cool, right? He, however, despises Joseph Stalin. He does not think he can be trusted. He does not think that Stalin is a very good leader, and really, if he had his way, he wouldn't be dealing with Stalin at all. But FDR just kind of like, dude, just chill. Like, I got Stalin. Like, don't you worry about Stalin. I got him. It's fine, right? It's fine. The other problem here is he's actually on the way out of power at home. He had not been doing so great in terms of the British economy, and a lot of people have been starting to question if he's a little too gung-ho. So even as the war is wrapping up, Winston Churchill is quickly losing power. He actually is eventually going to be replaced before the end of the war. Like I said, the reason he's out of power is because the economy is pretty bad. The new guy is going to be a guy named Attlee, so he's going to be the one that actually finishes the war for Great Britain. The next guy that we have is Chiang Kaishek. So like I said, he's not a major player. He's just kind of in one of the supporting roles, right? Chiang Kaishek is the leader of China, and China is not super powerful. They are allies of the U.S., and we like that. We kind of want them to be in the clique of allies, right? Like, we're just kind of like, hey, look, guys, like, don't you want to let China into our group? Kind of think about how, like, in Mean Girls, how they're, like, letting her into the group, right? That's essentially what's going on here. So we want them to be in the clique, and of course, like, they're super cool with that because they want to be popular. So he is constantly there going, you guys, remember, the United States is fighting on two fronts. We really need to help them out, right? So he's kind of got our back. He's got our back, right? Because we're going to make him popular, right? If we help him win, we gain an ally in Asia, and that's going to be really, really important for us, particularly as the war is finishing and we've been fighting Japan. We need an ally in Asia, and so we really want, China to be on our side, right? So that's why China is pretty important. Then we have Harry Truman. So as FDR passes away and Harry Truman takes over, we're going to find out that Harry Truman is a very different kind of personality. So he comes into play at the Potsdam Conference, and he's kind of underestimated. He's not, he's kind of seen as like a hick. He doesn't really know what he's doing. He's not super well educated. So the other allies don't really know what to do with Harry Truman. So they're kind of like, you're no FDR, right? Come on. But he is a pretty tough guy, right? And he's going to show that. Like, he doesn't put up with any nonsense. He doesn't put up with any crap. And he really doesn't trust Stalin. Like, FDR kind of thought Stalin was a joke. Truman knows that Stalin, there's a little bit more to him than meets the eye. And so he's kind of got his eye on Joseph Stalin a little bit. So let's go through these conferences here. So the first conference takes place in 1943 in Cairo, Egypt, and it is between FDR, Churchill, and Chiang Kaishek. So the first thing that they kind of decide is that Korea, which had been controlled by Japan, is going to get to be independent. Taiwan, which had been taken over by Japan, is going to be returned to China. So these are pretty much decisions that deal with the Asian front, right? So this is how we're going to get Chiang Kai-shek on our side, is that we're going to kind of like, hey, you get this territory back. The next conference is in Tehran in November of that same year. So instead of Chiang Kai-shek, this time it's with Joseph Stalin. So basically what we say is that the U.S. and Britain are going to open up that second front in Europe to take the pressure off the Soviets. So that way that Stalin is going to be able to manage a little bit more easily. The USS, in return, the USSR, is going to help U.S. beat Japan after they defeat Hitler. So, we'll help you out if you promise to help us out once we defeat Hitler. And it doesn't always work out super well. The next conference, and this is probably one of the most important ones, in Yalta, which is in the USSR. So this is FDR, Churchill, and Stalin again. And basically they decide a few things. First of all, at the end of the war crime trials are going to be held. These are going to be held in Nuremberg. These are called the Nuremberg trials. This is the first time that trials are held to try people for crimes against humanity, specifically the Holocaust in this case. The next thing that we're going to do is set up a new League of Nations, essentially, but this time it's going to be called the United Nations. The League of Nations have not been super successful, so we're hoping that maybe we can come up with something else that's going to work a little better. The next thing that we say is at the end of the war, we're going to divide Germany into 4 zones, as well as the capital of Berlin, so we can help kind of rebuild Germany. Right? So if you look at this map here, basically what we're doing is taking a knife and carving it up between the allies. And that way, Britain can help rebuild this part of Germany, France this part, us this part, and the Soviet Union this part. We do the same in Berlin, where it's divided up. This is going to be really, really important, okay? So don't forget this, because once we hit the Cold War, it's going to be pretty major. The next thing that we have is that the U.S. will give the USSR islands in the Pacific to help them come help us defeat Japan. It's been 2 years, right? They still haven't come help us out. So they're like, hey, well, if you help us out, we'll let you have some of these islands. Like, come on, man. Come on, Stalin. Let's get on this ball, right? So that's just kind of to try and help them get on our side. The next one's in Potsdam. So this is in Germany. This is in July of 1945. So this is after the German surrender. Okay. Truman is now in charge. So this is kind of how we're going to deal with Germany, right? So 6.5 million Germans, which have moved kind of to other parts of Eastern Europe, are going to be going back to Germany. We're going to let them relocate back to Germany. Some of them moved to get away from Hitler. Some of them were Jews or other groups that had been in concentration camps or death camps. So we're going to let them come back. So that's a pretty big deal. The next one that we have is in San Francisco. This is where the official peace treaty is signed. There's 50 different nations who are represented. This is truly a world war, right? We've not talked about all the different countries, but there are a lot of countries involved. So the first thing they do is set up the United Nations, right? So they had talked about it way back 2 years before. They officially set up the United Nations. All nations are going to have a seat in the General Assembly. So there's two parts of the UN. One is the General Assembly, where kind of the big decisions are made. However, there's also going to be something called the Security Council. And the Allied powers of World War II are going to have a permanent seat. So you'll notice Chiang Kaishek gets to be one of the official allies. So China, US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union get this permanent seat on the Security Council. The Security Council will be able to veto any decisions made in the General Assembly. So if the General Assembly votes for something and all the Security Council disagrees with it, they can veto that, okay? All other nations will share rotating seats in the Security Council. So it's not just going to be those 5 countries. There are 6 additional seats that nations get to rotate in and out of, okay? The next one is in Washington, D.C. So this is mostly of the Far East Commission, so kind of dealing with Asia now that the war in Asia is over. So Douglas MacArthur is going to lead the occupation of Japan. So we're basically going to occupy Japan until 1951. Freedom of the press, women's rights, and labor unions are all going to be protected in Japan. And large businesses that have been kind of in control are going to be broken up there. So as you can see, this kind of shows how we're dealing with these nations. We're attempting to stop some of those problems that we had faced during World War I. We're going to see kind of how well this goes and if this really works out as well as we had hoped. So I'll see you next time.